Hi, it is Saturday, April 22nd, 2023, and over the past week I have completed a reading of this book, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, all 1,000+ pages. It's the longest book I've ever completed, and it's one that I had started several times in the past, but then kind of gotten distracted or felt maybe like it was just too much to get through. It was a significant time commitment. It took me about a week to read it, and um, I don't know. On average, I probably was reading about 5 to 6 hours a day out of that week. So it's a significant read, and I'm not a speed reader, so maybe some people could read it faster. But I also took certain notes and stuff in the side. There were parts of the book where I kind of felt like, oh, I kind of disagree with this part, and I'd kind of make a note, and then some of those things it was later on clarified. For example, and also I want to say this about this video is I'm gonna essentially spoil parts of the book. If you haven't read the book, if you don't want to know the plot, if it's something you're planning to read, that's something to consider. But I'll also say that I had previously, there was a movie, or actually three movies made based on the three parts of the book, and I had previously watched those, so I had a kind of an outline of the plot prior to going into it, and I actually felt like that was actually beneficial to me, um, because there is a lot of characters to keep track of. There's a lot of nuance, and I don't I don't think it hurts that much to have a basic idea of what the book's about before reading it. Um, so with that said, there was uh, as one example of where I made a note was when she finally, so they essentially, what happens in this book is that this guy John Galt, he launches this strike of basically the most intelligent, most productive people in society, saying that, you know what, we're not going to actually work to support this system, that we have this government system that's growing and these bad ideas that are ultimately going to end up in the destruction of society. We're actually going to speed that process along because we believe that in the wake of that destruction, um, we can rebuild society as a free world. Which, of course, as libertarians, this is the goal: is to have a free world, a free economy, and so as part of this strike, a lot of these people started kind of gathering in this one place and developing this one area kind of outside of the view of government and calling it, we can call it Atlantis. That's a word they refer to in the book. Um, so when our main character is this lady Dagny who works for this railroad, and when she first gets to this Atlantis and she meets John Galt, he tells her, "Oh, there's one word that we don't allow, and that word is give." Um, and I thought to myself, "Oh, well, now that I don't agree with." I thought, I I don't support extortion. I don't support the government taking money and giving it to whoever they want, by taking it from someone else at gunpoint. But I've always felt that charity, personal charity, if I want to personally support a cause with money that I've earned, then that's something I should be free to do. And that's an okay moral thing to do if it's something that I believe in. And so I thought to not be able to give at all is not ideal. But then later in the book, when she gets into, so John Galt ends up making this big address, where he kind of takes over the radio waves, and in that address he actually clarifies this a lot, where he says, do you ask if it's ever proper to help another man? No, if he claims it as his right or as a moral duty that you owe him. Yes, if such is your own desire, based on your own selfish pleasure in the value of his person and his struggle. Suffering as such is not a value, only man's fight against suffering is. If you choose to help a man who suffers, do it on the ground of his virtues, of his fight to recover, of his rational record, or of the fact that he suffers unjustly, then your action is still a trade and his virtue is the payment for your help. So that's what I'm talking about. There are clauses where, imagine you just have a child that you bring into the world. You're going to take care of this child. That is an act of giving of yourself, but it's also it's a selfish motive in the sense that you're appealing to your own sense of compassion, your own love for that child. And so I kind of that kind of cleared up, and I felt a bit better after reading that. So for the most part, there were very few notes I made. There was very little that I really disagreed with, as far as her philosophy. And she talks about, she's very condemning of the mystics, meaning kind of the followers of religion. But I don't, that's a whole other topic we can get into another day, as far as what my reasons for believing in the so-called mystical things that I believe in, which I don't believe are mystical at all. I think they're just parts of this universe that exists. That's a whole other thing. So the philosophy generally I thought was quite good. I thought it was non-contradictory and valuable. So, by the way, another thing I want to say is that my videos tend to cut out after about 20 minutes. So if this goes longer than that, I'll just simply start a new video. And so it might cut off suddenly, and then I'll post a second part 2 or whatever. Because I do want to cover some of this. This book essentially, I think, is while it is a work of fiction, I think it's also kind of a projection of how she saw things going from her viewpoint when she wrote the book, as far as the expansion of government and how it would ultimately destroy the economy, to the point where at the end of the book, it's like absolute obliteration. The lights of New York City finally go out, and there's no food, there's no transportation, there's not even electricity, and the people are really just left to perish. Which is, of course, the end game of central planning, of government. This is, the laws of economics are the laws of economics. The law of supply, the law of demand are the laws of supply and demand. And the problem is there are a lot of people in society who are not receptive to this information. Yesterday on Twitter went as far as explaining the laws of supply and demand and how they are rational laws based on the rational decisions that humans make. And I said, if you've ever sold anything, you'll understand that the more someone's willing to give you, the more likely you are to sell that thing. If you own anything, the more money someone's going to give you for it, the more likely you are to sell it. It's the more incentive you have to sell it. I mean, these are rational laws, and there's just this obstinance and this refusal to learn it that exists in a large amount of people in society. Most people in society, whether they're self-proclaimed socialists or whether they're simply conservatives who believe in central planning when it comes to things like the government setting laws over what who can play in various sports leagues, or um, what basically the morality of what people are allowed to engage in, whether they can do drugs, whether they can sell their bodies as objects of sexual desire, So both groups believe in this idea that government should control society at the point of a gun, and should rob society to fund itself. And so, uh, this is, of course, a huge problem. Now, there's two main differences between the future that I think she foresaw and how things have actually come to play out. And maybe this isn't, maybe, she didn't really see this formation of Atlantis as like something that was likely to happen. Maybe that was more of like, well, it would be cool if this did happen. Um, but it hasn't happened. What's happened is, yeah, there's homesteaders. There are people who have done everything they can, understanding that this economy is going to collapse, to become self-sufficient um, off the land that they live on. But what that's going to require is a lot of work and a lot of being self-sustaining. They're not relying on a lot of trade with others, because they're seeing essentially what happens at the end, this continent just becoming a dark continent of what essentially become savages, people who just are going to do whatever they can to try to get food, and they're not going to be doing any productive labor, just essentially trying to steal. So what happens in the book, they form this Atlantis. They have a whole community of these really smart people, where they have mining operations, and they have uh, refineries, and they have the production of copper and iron, and all the things that you would need to form an industrial society kind of exist within this enclosed community, which becomes self-sufficient, but not just self-sufficient for the purposes of survival, self-sufficient for carrying on the industrial age, which we don't really have that. We have maybe communities that would be self-sufficient for the purpose of survival, but not entire industrial operations that would be part of that community. So that's one key difference, is that first of all, the other key difference is that while she saw this kind of gradual deterioration as the effects of the government policies destroyed society, we haven't seen that as much because of the expansion of credit. Because in the West, we've been able to borrow money to make up for the shortfall in production. We've been able to mooch off the production of the rest of the world, to make up for the lack of our own, to maintain a standard of living that has been far higher than our actual production would warrant. So, what we're going to experience, instead of this gradual deterioration, is a sudden collapse, where all of a sudden we go from having food and electricity and all the things that we have in modern society, to being a period of days or at most weeks away from all of that coming completely undone, because the credit markets have completely collapsed, and there's just no way for businesses in this society to continue to function. And there's widespread unemployment and widespread desperation amongst the people, which of course will then lead to widespread violence and further deteriorate, so that the whole economy will collapse from a state of uh, stability that we have now to a state of complete chaos, as seen at the end of Atlas Shrugged. And so these two differences, so we have a sudden collapse instead of a gradual collapse, and we have no Atlantis, no self-sufficient industrial society to begin from. We have to begin from anyone who manages to maintain a homestead, uh, which is going to be potentially no one, because the number of people who have these self-sufficient farms and things to live off compared to the number of people in the entire population is minuscule. And so they'll be massively outnumbered when trying to fight off these savages, which is going to be 99% of the population who isn't prepared to become completely self-sufficient. And so even these people, I was listening to a guy once talking about he had lived through the hyperinflation in Bolivia, I believe it was, or Argentina, or one of these countries that had experienced that. And he was saying that, the people who were out in the boonies who had these farms and stuff, these were the people who got targeted. And it makes sense. People are going to get desperate. There's going to be no food in the city. They're going to go out in the country. They're going to try, and just the numbers and the fact that trade's going to be completely cut off is going to make it very unlikely, very difficult for anyone to survive. And if anyone does, they're going to be starting not with a self-contained industrial civilization, but basically an agrarian civilization where they're literally just living off the land, and it's going to take generations and generations to reform a society, as we kind of go back to essentially the Dark Ages, or at least maybe they're reliant on a generator that's going to last for a generation, but they don't have the capability of uh, re of making their own generator, the materials and everything else they would need to do that. So um, when I look at society as it is today, I say, the only way to carry on industrial civilization will be for the infrastructure, all the mining, the transportation, the manufacturing, the farming that goes on today in the commercial farming, the leverage of modern technology, the industrial processes that leverage modern technology, these things need to somehow remain intact. So what that means is the entirety of society needs to become uh, Atlantis, right? And so the problem is we got a bunch of people who don't believe that this is the solution. And in Atlas Shrugged, even at the end when they realize that their only chance is John Galt and his ideas, even then they are still unable to accept his ideas. He says, well, I think we should end all taxation, and they say, well, no, that's crazy. And so, she proposes that these people ultimately seek death, that actually it's a death cult, and that their objective isn't to make things better for themselves, but ultimately just to destroy everything that is good and to destroy life itself. Well, I guess that's going to be put to the test, man, because we're going to get to a point where we have our collapse, and we're just going to have to see how people respond. I've produced a book that talks about how we can regrow a free economy, how we can keep the infrastructure we have to the degree that it will be useful in place, how we can leverage the systems that exist and the reality that exists to set a foundation for a free economy. Because I don't believe that when push comes to shove, I think the reason that people are so pro-government and so unwilling to listen and to learn is because the status quo has been acceptable, because this expansion of credit has allowed people to survive. But when the food runs out, when the collapse is here, this will be the choice, man. Freedom or death, man. And, you know, I guess whether my faith in humanity is justified or not, it's my only hope. I think it's anyone's only real hope, because there's just too many people that aren't just gonna disappear. I mean, even in Atlas Shrugged, I mean, this community out there in the wilderness would surely be discovered eventually. I mean, people would be roaming the land looking for food. I mean, looking for anything to plunder, and surely eventually someone would stumble upon this isolated kind of location that they had, and then they would notify others, and they would come and they would attempt to plunder. And even though their community might have armed defenses, how many thousands, how many people would they have to ward off? Would they be successful? I don't know. But they would have a lot more chance of success than a single landowner and his maybe a few people in the neighborhood will have. So I guess I didn't need a second video. I guess that's about all I got to say about that. So, great book. I was proud of myself for completing it. I think gives me maybe a little more credibility in the eyes of libertarians who expect you to do things like that. But it was an enjoyable read. It was a page turner. It was there's a lot of really amazing moments in the book, where just the way things are worded and the way things play out are just pretty awesome. And in a way, it has a hopeful ending given the circumstances of the book, although maybe one that should leave us pretty hopeless. And maybe that's a good thing, because once people become hopeless, the idea of the unknown, which the idea of a free economy is to most people, can start to offer hope rather than threaten the status quo, which they are so attached to. So, with that, you guys have a good weekend.